A lot of people do want to invest in these inner city blue chip areas, but obviously it's pretty expensive. For a 2-bedroom unit in most of the cities, it can be around 5, 6, 7, 800,000. Now, that's not going to be in everyone's budget. So the main thing to do is, if you're a first home buyer, it's really just get your first step on the ladder. You're never going to be able to buy the perfect property. So just buy something in the best area possible, let it grow in value, pull the equity out, and then use that equity as deposits. And ideally then you've got a higher income to try and get into that suburb. And for those people that already do own property, quite often they've paid a lot of it off, or it's risen in value, there's a lot of equity there. Use the equity for your deposit, but also there'll be quite a difference between the rent and the mortgage. And so you can actually use your equity in your home to actually help cash flow the difference between the rent and the mortgage. It's like kind of working capital in a business. So look, if there's a will, there's a way. So if you really want to buy in those areas, then there's always something you can do to get in there. Typically the best way to get capital gains is really to try and find areas that are about to grow or are basically going to consistently grow. So if you go for the inner city areas, they're typically going to be more of a guaranteed decade after decade they're going to grow. Whereas if you want to go further out, then there's a lot more chance of really trying to find that hotspot. So trying to find somewhere where there's maybe a new railway being put in, maybe there's new roads around there, maybe there's a new Westfield, or there's a lot of work going on that's suddenly going to boost that local economy. Now, obviously, it's pretty hard to do those kind of things, and that's where if you can use companies like Residex or RP Data that actually look at some of the stats, both historically and in the future, that's probably going to give you a better idea of exactly what's going to happen. And because those companies are independent, there's a much greater chance that they're probably going to do better than you. Ultimately, there's probably a million different property investing strategies, and it really depends on you. It depends on your income. It depends on what you're trying to get out of the properties and really what your time frame is. So some of the major strategies would be the buy and hold, and that's really to buy a property, hold on to it forever, and basically refinance every year and take your cash out. Some other people's strategies is to basically buy, renovate and flip. So that's where you buy a property, you do a major renovation, and then obviously you sell it and use the profits to then put into the next property. But the problems with that is that there's a lot of costs of buying and reselling, and obviously a lot of tax if you're making a profit as well. Now, another strategy is off the plan, and that's good, where you don't have to put too much money down. Ideally, you buy a property today, it takes a couple of years to get built, and by the time you actually pay for it, ideally it's then risen from 500 to 600, which means that you need to put very little kind of deposit down. The other kind of strategies are you investing for capital growth or for rental yield? And there's always been a massive debate on which is the right answer. Ultimately, capital growth is great because it gives you a chance to take big lump sums of deposit to put into the next property. But the downside is quite often there's a big difference between the rent and the mortgage. And so the banks don't really like you because you're negative cash flowed. Whereas on the positive cash flow properties, that's great because the rent actually covers the mortgage, which makes it easy to cash flow. But then quite often the disadvantage about those kind of properties is that it doesn't necessarily rise in value as much, and so it's harder to get your deposit for the next property. So there's no perfect answer, there's pros and cons to every strategy. There are always going to be cash flow positive properties around. Sometimes it's dictated by the location and where they are. It's typically, they could be just high rentals there, for instance maybe in mining towns. But sometimes even in the inner city locations, which are more capital growth areas, you can still get positive cash flow. So if you've got a property and there's maybe 2 or 3 streams of income, so maybe there's one property and it's split into a couple of units, then quite often that gives you exceptional rent returns. Typically the blue chip suburbs are those that are generally in the inner city locations. So quite often investors avoid the CBDs because within the CBD there's no limit of supply. You get these massive towers that have got 1,000 units in them, and effectively they can knock down a few small buildings and keep building more and more of those things. So quite often we're really trying to get maybe 2 to 5 Ks just outside the city, out to about 15 Ks, because that's where the majority of people really want to work. That's where they get all the leisure facilities. So certainly in Sydney, then you've got the beach or the harbour, and you've got all the cafes, the lifestyles, the parks for all the kids, but you're still within maybe 10 or 20 minutes of the city. So a lot of investors always go for that 5 to 15 Ks, whether you're in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane or Perth, then they're quite often the suburbs that decade after decade will consistently grow. If you're buying around the median price, then often those properties don't really go down in value even in the GFC, because there's just so much demand. There's 80% of the population can afford to buy them or rent them. That creates the stability, and in the good times that creates the capital growth as well. When a lot of people start to property invest, they're always trying to make money by saving money, and they're always trying to skimp on things. Whereas generally the professional investors actually spend a lot of money, and they really spend money to make money. So great resources are things like Residex and RP Data. Residex produce a quarterly report which gives you the top 50 or top 100 suburbs in the area, and that might only cost you $200. That's $200 very, very well spent. People like RP Data, when you actually find a property that you're interested in, quite often RP Data can give you the history of what's happened to that property or what's happened in the street or that suburb. And again, you may pay $50 or $100 for that kind of information. But when you're buying 500 or 600 grand properties or even 300 grand properties, that information is really, really valuable and can save you tens of thousands, because quite often a single bid is $10,000 with these properties. So I believe in buying all the books, buying all the magazines, getting all the research information, and even if you spend a few $1,000s, it really is money well spent. There's lots of different ways to find property, and for most people they know Domain and realestate.com, and there's a number of other websites as well. And that's going to probably get you 90% of the properties or 95% of the properties that are around. Typically though, what the professional buyers do and the buyer's agents, we're always trying to get silent sales. And what a silent sale is it's a sale that hasn't been advertised to the public. Now the reason we're trying to find those is if we're negotiating direct with a vendor or with an agent just on one property and there's one of us, we haven't got the competition of an auction with maybe 20 or 30 other people, obviously no one else is driving the price up. So a lot of people say, well, why would anyone sell their property as a silent sale rather than tell everyone? Well, quite often people get divorced, they need to get a quick sale. Quite often they might have bought another property and again, they need a quick sale. And so sometimes it's a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. So they might rather take a guaranteed 500,000 rather than risk go to auction, maybe make 515, 525, but if it doesn't go well, then they might only get 475. And so that's a classic reason that if you give someone a reasonable offer, that's what they're expecting anyway. They don't want the hassle of people going in and out of their house. They don't want the emotions of auctions. And so if they can get a guarantee, quite often that's a great reason to get a silent sale. So I might buy 60, 70% of my properties, and I'm buying one a week at the moment. Then if I can get those as silent sales, then I'm getting good prices. So there's another great debate about whether you buy houses or you buy units. Now the argument for buying houses is that land appreciates and buildings depreciate, and so if you buy a higher content of land, i.e. in a house, then you're going to make more money. And look, that is certainly true. The problem is though, is that in the blue chip suburbs, you generally can't afford to buy a house because a house in those kind of areas is around 2 or 3 million. Now $2 or $3 million houses don't rent very well, because not many people can afford $2,000 or $3,000 a week. So rather than getting maybe a 4 or 5% rent return, you might only get 1 or 2. And so this is where quite often people buy units in those blue chip inner city areas, because even though they may not have as much land content, they're in much greater demand. They're more around the median price, and so they're cheaper, easier to get into, and lots of people can afford to rent them. So whilst the units haven't got the land content, I believe a unit in a blue chip suburb will rise by more than a house in maybe a secondary suburb. For most investors, the typical numbers that they're trying to get is ideally they're trying to get roughly 7 to 10% capital growth, which means a property roughly doubles every 7 to 10 years. And ideally they're trying to get around 4 or 5% rent return. So that would be typical in a blue chip inner city area. Now, if you go further outside those areas, typically quite often the rent return starts to increase, so you might get 5, 6, 7, 8% rent returns, but quite often as the rent returns rise, then the capital growth falls, so you might only be getting 4, 5, 6%. So it's a bit like a seesaw in a way. You kind of choose exactly how much capital growth and rent return you want, and for most of those kind of areas, that's typically what you're going to get. But look, in a perfect world, if you can renovate and you can add some value, maybe get a couple of income streams, ideally if you can get 10% capital growth and 6 or 7% yield, then you're doing pretty well. Typical renters in the blue chip inner city areas are generally your professionals, your suits. And so The reason that those areas are pretty good is because a lot of those people work pretty long hours. They might work 40 or 60 hours a week. They probably typically earn maybe $70,000 to $100,000. But quite often with young people these days is they don't want to save deposits up. They want to enjoy their life. They have their cars, their holidays and the rest of it. And so even though they're financially pretty stable, they're not necessarily buyers themselves, but they make great renters. Because they work for generally good firms, they're always going to make sure they pay their rent on time. They don't want any of that hassle of being kind of kicked out of home or causing trouble with the landlords. And so they're a great person to have as a renter and to look after your investment, because even in a GFC, typically young people will always have jobs. Whereas if you move into the outer areas and you're investing more in houses, quite often if there's a family unit and perhaps one of the partners is actually looking after the kids, you've then only got one income earner for a big house. Whereas a two-bedroom unit, you've got two separate income earners. They're not related necessarily, and so that just makes it a lot more safe as an investment. When it comes to renting, the best thing to do is, rather than try and do it yourself where you've got no understanding of it, is really hire a professional property manager to look after things. Because it's really in their vested interest to put the best tenant in there, because if the tenant causes problems, they've got to deal with it and they may have to go to court. So typically the kind of people that you may want to avoid is probably the backpackers and the travellers, because they're not going to be around so much. They're probably going to have more parties and kind of cause a bit more trouble. Some people wouldn't like maybe the students around it as well, because maybe again they're not going to look after the place. But these are kind of generalisations. So you can make money out of anyone. You can get good renters and bad renters. It's really making sure you do all the checks up front, setting the guidelines down, but also finding the right tenant for that property. Because if you're buying 100 grand properties, you're not going to get someone that's on a few hundred grand renting that property. And again, if you're buying 500 or 600 grand properties, just by definition of the rent being pretty expensive, you're typically not going to get a lot of the lower income people coming in there.